The Quest of Mr. Teeby, a short story by Sarah O. Jewett. The trees were bare on meadow and hill, and all about the country one saw the warm brown of lately fallen leaves. There was still a cheerful bravery of green in sheltered places, a fine live green that flattered the eye with its look of permanence. The first 3/4 of the year seemed to have worked out their slow processes to make this perfect late autumn day. In such weather, I found even the East Wilby railroad station attractive, and waiting 3 hours for a slow train became a pleasure. The delight of idleness and even booklessness cannot be properly described. The interior of the station was bleak and gravelly, but it would have been possible to find fault with any interior on such an out-of-doors day, and after the station master had locked his ticket office door and tried the handle twice, with a comprehensive look at me, he went slowly away up the road to spend some leisure time with his family. He had ceased to take any interest in the travelling public and answered my questions as briefly as possible. After he had gone some distance, he turned to look back, but finding that I still sat on the baggage truck in the sunshine just where he left me, he smothered his natural apprehensions and went on. One might spend a good half-hour in watching crows as they go southward resolutely through the clear sky, and then waver and come straggling back as if they had forgotten something. One might think over all one's immediate affairs, and learn to know the outward aspect of such a place as East Wilby, as if born and brought up there. But after a while, I lost interest in both past and future. There was too much landscape before me at the moment, and a lack of figures. The weather was not to be enjoyed merely as an end, yet there was no temptation to explore the uphill road on the left, or the level fields on the right. I sat still on my baggage truck and waited for something to happen. Sometimes one is so happy that there is nothing left to wish for but to be happier, and just as the remembrance of this truth illuminated my mind, I saw 2 persons approaching from opposite directions. The first to arrive was a pleasant-looking elderly countrywoman, well wrapped in a worn winter cloak with a thick plaid shawl over it, and a white worsted cloud tied over her bonnet. She carried a well-preserved bandbox, the outlines were perfect under its checked gingham cover, and had a large bundle beside, securely rolled in a newspaper. From her dress, I felt sure that she had made a mistake in dates and expected winter to set in at once. Her face was crimson with undue warmth, and what appeared in the end to have been unnecessary haste. She did not take any notice of the elderly man who reached the platform a minute later, until they were near enough to take each other by the hand and exchange most cordial greetings. "Well, this is a treat," said the man, who was a small and shivery-looking person. He carried a great umbrella and a thin, enamelled cloth valise, and wore an ancient little silk hat and a nearly new greenish linen duster, as if it were yet summer. "I was full of thinking of you day before yesterday. Strange, wasn't it?" he announced impressively, in a plaintive voice. "I was saying to myself if there was one living being I coveted to encounter over East Wilby way, it was you, Sister Pinkham." "Warm today, ain't it?" responded Sister Pinkham. "How's your health, Mr. Teeby? I guess I'd better set right down here on the edge of the platform. Shan't we get more air than if we went inside the depot? It's necessary to get my breath before I rise the hill." "You can't seem to account for them foresights," continued Mr. Teeby, putting down his tall, thin valise and letting the empty top of it fold over. Then he stood his umbrella against the end of my baggage truck without a glance at me. I was glad that they were not finding me in their way. "Well, if this ain't very singular, I never saw nothing that was," repeated the little man. "Nobody can set forth to explain why the thought of you should have been so borne in upon me day before yesterday, your living countenance and all. And here we be today set inside o' one another. I've come to rely on them foresights. They've been of considerable use in my business too." "Trade good as common this fall?" inquired Sister Pinkham languidly. "You don't carry such a thing as a good palm leaf fan amongst your stuff, I expect. It does appear to me as if I hadn't been more het up any day this year." "I should have had the observation to offer it before," said Mr. Teeby, with pride. "Yes, Sister Pinkham, I've got an excellent fan right here, and you shall have it." He reached for his bag. I heard a clink, as if there were bottles within. Presently his companion began to fan herself with that steady sway and lop of the palm leaf which one sees only in country churches in midsummer weather. Mr. Teeby edged away a little, as if he feared such a steady trade wind. "We might have picked out a shadier spot on your account," he suggested. "Can't you unpin your shawl?" "Not while I'm so het," answered Sister Pinkham coldly. "Is there anything new recommended for rheumatic complaints?" "They're getting up new compounds right straight along, and send sights of printed bills urging of me to buy 'em. I don't beseech none of my customers to take them strange nostrums that I ain't able to recommend." "Some is new cotches made of the good old standbys, I expect," said Sister Pinkham, and there was a comfortable silence of some minutes. "I'm kind of surprised to meet with you today, when all's said and done. It kind of started me when I see it was you, after dwelling on you so day before yesterday," insisted Mr. Teeby. And this time, Sister Pinkham took heed of the interesting coincidence. "Thinking of me, was you?" And she stopped the fan a moment and turned to look at him with interest. "I was so. Well, I never see nobody that kept her looks as you do, and been a sufferer too, as one may express it." Sister Pinkham sighed heavily and began to ply the fan again. "You were saying just now that you found them foresight notions work into your business." "Yes'm. I saved a valuable life this last spring. I was putting up my vials to start out over Briggsville way, and it was impressed upon me that I'd better carry a portion of Oppadildac. I was loaded up heavy, had all I could lug of spring goods, salts and seany, and them big bottle spring bitters of mine that folks counts on regular. I couldn't get the Oppadildac out of my mind no way, and I didn't want it for nothing nor nobody, but I had to remove a needed vial of some kind of essence to give it place. When I was going down the lane towards Abel Dean's house, his women folks come flying out. 'Child's a-dying in here,' says they, 'tumbled down the cellar stairs.' They was like crazy creatures. I give 'em the vial right there in the lane, and they run in and I followed 'em. Last time I was there, the child was a-playing out, looked rugged and hearty. They've never forgot it and never will," said Mr. Teeby impressively, with a pensive look toward the horizon. "Want me to stop overnight with 'em any time, or come and take the hoss or anything? Miss Dean, she buys 4 times the essences and stuff she wants. Kinda gratified, you see, and didn't want to lose the child, I expect, though she's got a number of others. If it hadn't been for its being so impressed on my mind, I should have omitted that Oppadildac. I deem it a winter remedy, chiefly." "Perhaps the young one would have come to without none. They do survive right through everything, and then again they seem to be taken away right in their tracks." Sister Pinkham grew more talkative as she cooled. "Heard any news as you come along?" "Some," vaguely responded Mr. Teeby. "Folks generally relates anything that's occurred since they see me before. I ain't no great hand for news, and never was." "Pity about you, Uncle Teeby. There anybody don't like to have deaths occur in them things and be unawares of 'em, and the last to know when folks calls in." Sister Pinkham laughed at first, but said her say with spirit, Certain, we ought all of us to show an interest. I did hear it reported that Elder Fry calculates to give up preaching and go into the creamery business another spring. You know he's had means left him, and his throat's kind of give out. Trouble with the pipes. I called it brown caters, and explained nigh as I could without hurtin' of his pride that he'd bawled more'n any pipes could stand. I get so wore out settin' under him that I feel to go and lay right out in the woods arterwards where it's still. 'Twon't never do for him to deal so with callin' of his cows. They'd be so aggravated it would be more'n any butter business could bear. You hadn't ought to speak so light now. He's a very feelin' man towards anyone in trouble." Sister Pinkham rebuked the speaker. "I set considerable by Elder Fry. You sort of divert yourself dallying round the country with your essences and remedies, and you ain't never sagged down with no settled grievance as most do. Think of what the elder's been through, a-losing of 3 good wives. I'm one of them that ain't found life come none too easy, and Elder Fry's preachin' stayed my mind considerable." "I suppose you're right, if you think you be," acknowledged the little man humbly. "I can't say as I esteem myself so fortunate as most. I in a lonesome creature, and always was. You know I be. I did expect somebody'd engage my affections before this." "There, plenty'd be glad to have ye." "I expect they would, but I don't seem to be drawed to none on 'em," replied Mr. Teeby with a mournful shake of his head. I've spoke pretty decided to quite a number in my time, take 'em all together, but it always appeared best not to follow it up. And so, when I'd come their way again, I'd laugh it off or something in case it was referred to. I see one now and then that I kind of fancy, but it ain't the real thing. You mustn't expect to pick out a handsome gal at your age, insisted Sister Pinkham in a businesslike way. Time's past for all that, and you've got the name of a rover. I've heard some say that you was rich, but that ain't everything. You must take who you can get and look you up a good home. I would. If you was to be taken down with any settled complaint, you'd be distressed to be without a place of your own, and I'm glad to have this chance to tell you so. Plenty of folks is glad to take you in for a short spell, and you've had an excellent chance to look the ground over well. I tell you, you're beginning to get along in years. I know I be, said Mr. Teeby. I can't travel now as I used to. I have to favour my left leg. I do know, but I be spoilt for settling down. This business I never meant to follow stiddy in the first place. It was a means to an end, as one may say. Folks would miss ye, but you could take a good long trip, say spring and fall, and live quiet the rest of the year. What if they do get out a essence of lemon and peppermint? There's sufficient to the stores. 'Tain't as it used to be when you begun. There's Anne Maria Hart, my oldest sister's daughter. I kind of call it home with her by spells and when the travelling's bad. Good King Agrippi, if that's the best you can do, I feel for you, exclaimed the energetic adviser. She's a harmless creature and seems to keep plodding, but slack ain't no description and runs on talking about nothing till it strikes right in and numbs ye. She's pressed for house room too. Hart ought to put on an addition long ago, but he's too stingy to live. Folks was telling me that somebody observed to him how he'd got a real good stiddy man to work with him this summer. He's called a very pious man too. Great hand in meetings, Mr. Hart, says they, and says he, I'd have you recollect he's a praying out of my time. Said it hasty too, as if he meant it. Well, I can put up with Hart. He's near, but he uses me well. And I try to do the same by him. I don't bang on him. I pay my way, and I feel as if everything was temporary. I did plan to go way over North Dexter way, where I've never been, and see if there wants somebody. But the weather ain't been settled as I could wish. I'm always expecting to find her. I be so. At which I observed Sister Pinkham's frame shake. I felt a slight reproach of conscience at listening so intently to these entirely private affairs, and at this point reluctantly left my place and walked along the platform to remind Sister Pinkham and confiding Mr. Teeby of my neighbourhood. They gave no sign that there was any objection to the presence of a stranger, and so I came back gladly to the baggage truck, and we all kept silence for a little while. A fine flavour of extracts was wafted from the valise to where I sat. I pictured to myself the solitary and hopeful wanderings of Mr. Teeby. There was an air about him of some distinction. He might have been a decayed member of the medical profession. I observed that his hands were unhardened by any sort of rural work, and he sat there a meek and appealing figure, with his antique hat and linen duster, beside the well-wadded round shoulders of friendly Sister Pinkham. The expression of their backs was most interesting. You might express it that I've got quite a number of good homes. I've got me sorted out a few regular places where I mostly stop, Mr. Teeby explained presently. I like to visit with the old folks and speak of the past together, and the boys and gals, they always have some kind of fun going on when I get along. They always have to get me out to the barn and tell me if they're a courting, and I fetch and carry for 'em in that case and help out all I can. I've made peace when they got into some of their misunderstanding, and them times they set a good deal by Uncle Teeby, but they ain't all got along as well as they expected, and that's been one thing that's made me desirous not to get fooled myself. But I do know as folks would be reconciled to my settling down in one place. I've gathered a good many extra receipts for things, and folks all calls me something of a doctor. You know my grand there was one on my mother's side. Well, you've had my counsel for what it is wooth, said the woman, not unkindly. Trouble is, you want better bread than's made o' wheat. I'm most ashamed to ask ye again if it would be any use to lay the matter before Hannah Jane Pinkham. This was spoken lower, but I could hear the gentle suggestion. I'm obleeged to you, said the lady of Mr. Teeby's choice, but I ain't the right one. Don't you go to setting your mind on me. 'Tain't worthwhile. I'm older than you be, and apt to break down with my rheumatic complaints. You don't want nobody on your hands. I'd get a younger woman, I would so. I've been a-looking for the right one a sight o' years, Hannah Jane. I've had a kind of notion I should know her right off when I fust see her, but I'm afeard it ain't going to be that way. I've seen a sight o' nice, smart women, but when the thought of you was so impressed on my mind day before yesterday, I'm sorry to disoblige you, but if I have anybody, I'm kind of half-promised to Elder Fry, announced Sister Pinkham bravely. I consider it more on the offside than I did at first. If he'd continued preaching, I'd favour it more, but I dread having to tend to a growing butter business and to sense them new machines. 'Tain't as if he'd stablished it. I've just begun to have things easy. But there, I feel as if I had a lot of work left in me, and I don't know as it is right to let it go to waste. I expect the elder would preach some, by spells, and we could ride about and see folks, and he'd always be called to funerals, and have some variety one way and another. I urge him not to quit preaching. I'd rather he undertook most anything else, said Mr. Teeby, rising and trying to find the buttons of his linen duster. I could see a bitter shade of jealousy cloud his amiable face, but Sister Pinkham looked up at him and laughed. Set down, she said. We ain't in no great hurry. And Uncle Teeby relented and lingered. I'm all out of rosewater for the eyes, she told him, and if you've got a vial of lemon left that you'll part with reasonable, I do know, but I'll take that. I'd rather have caught you when you was outward bound. Your bag looks kinda slim. Everything is fresh made just before I started, 'cept the ginger and that I buy, but it's called the best there is. The two sat down and drove a succession of sharp bargains, but finally parted the best of friends. Mr. Teeby kindly recognised my presence from a business point of view and offered me a choice of his wares at reasonable prices. I asked about a delightful jumping jack which made its appearance and wished very much to become the owner, for it was curiously whittled out and fitted together by Mr. Teeby's own hands. He exhibited the toy to Sister Pinkham and me to our great pleasure, but scorned to sell such a trifle, it being worth nothing. And beside, he had made it for a little girl who lived 2 miles farther along the road he was following. I could see that she was a favourite of the old man's, and said no more about the matter, but provided myself, as recommended, with an ample package of court plaster, in case of accident before I got to where I was going, and a small bottle of smelling salts described as reviving to the faculties. Then we watched Mr. Teeby plod away, a quaint figure, with his large valise nearly touching the ground as it hung slack from his right hand. The greenish-brown duster looked bleak and unseasonable as a cloud went over the sun. It appeared to symbolise the youthful and spring-like hopes of the wearer, decking the autumn days of life. Poor creature, said Sister Pinkham. There, he doos need somebody to look after him. She turned to me frankly and I asked how far he was going. Oh, he'll put up at that little gal's house and get his dinner, and give her the jumping jack and trade a little, and then he'll work along the road, calling from place to place. He's got a good deal of system and was a smart boy, so that folks expected he was going to make a doctor, but he kind of petered out. He's long-winded and harping, and some folks praise him by if they can. But there, most likes him. And there's nobody would be more missed. He don't make no trouble for 'em. He'll take right holt and help, and there ain't nobody more gentle with the sick. Always has some of his nonsense over to me. This was added with sudden consciousness that I must have heard the recent conversation, but we only smiled at each other, and good Sister Pinkham did not seem displeased. We both turned to look again at the small figure of Mr. Teeby as he went away, with his queer, tripping gait, along the level road. Pretty day if it wa'n't quite so warm, said Sister Pinkham, as she rose and reached for her bandbox and bundle to resume her own journey. There, if here ain't Uncle Teeby's umbrella. He forgets everything that belongs to him but that old valise. Folks wouldn't know him if he left that. You may as well just hand it to Asa Briggs, the depot master, when he gets back. Like's not the old gentleman'll think to call for it as he comes back along. Here's his fan too, but he won't be likely to want that this winter. She looked at the large umbrella. There was a great deal of good material in it, but it was considerably out of repair. I don't know, but I'll stop and mend it up for him, poor old creature, she said slowly, with an apologetic look at me. Then she sat down again, pulled a large rolled-up needlebook from her deep and accessible pocket, and sewed busily for some time with strong stitches. I sat by and watched her, and was glad to be of use in chasing her large spool of linen thread, which repeatedly rolled away along the platform. Sister Pinkham's affectionate thoughts were evidently following her old friend. "I've a great mind to walk back with the umbrella. He may need it, and it ain't a great ways," she said to me, and then looked up quickly, blushing like a girl. I wished she would for my part, but it did not seem best for a stranger to give advice in such serious business. "I'll tell you what I will do," she told me innocently, a moment afterwards. "I'll take the umbrella along with me, and leave word with Asa Briggs I've got it. I go right by his house, so you needn't charge your mind nothing about it." By the time she had taken off her gold-bowed spectacles and put them carefully away and was ready to make another start, she had learned where I came from and where I was going and what my name was. All this being but poor return for what I had gleaned of the history of herself and Mr. Teeby. I watched Sister Pinkham until she disappeared, umbrella in hand, over the crest of a hill far along the road to the eastward. The Mistress of Sydenham Plantation, a short story by Sarah O. Jewett. A high wind was blowing from the water into the Beaufort streets, a wind with as much reckless hilarity as March could give to her breezes, but soft and spring-like, almost early summer-like, in its warmth. In the gardens of the old southern houses that stood along the bay, roses and pettisporum trees were blooming, with their delicious fragrance. It was the time of wistarias and wild white lilies, of the last yellow jasmines and the first Cherokee roses. It was the Saturday before Easter Sunday. In the quaint churchyard of Old St. Helena's Church, a little way from the bay, young figures were busy among the graves with industrious gardening. At first sight, one might have thought that this pretty service was rendered only from loving sentiments of loyalty to one's ancestors. For under the great live oaks, the sturdy brick walls about the family burying places and the gravestones themselves were moss-grown and ancient-looking. Yet here and there the wounded look of the earth appealed to the eye and betrayed a new-made grave. The old sarcophagi and heavy tablets of the historic Beaufort families stood side by side with plain wooden crosses. The armorial bearings and long epitaphs of the one and the brief lettering of the other suggested the changes that had come with the war to these families, yet somehow the wooden cross touched one's heart with closer sympathy. The padlocked gates to the small enclosures stood open while gentle girls passed in and out with their Easter flowers of remembrance. On the high churchyard wall and great gate-posts perched many a mockingbird, and the golden light changed the twilight under the live oaks to a misty warmth of colour. The birds began to sing louder. The grey moss that hung from the heavy boughs swayed less and less, and gave the place a look of pensive silence. In the church itself, most of the palms and rose branches were already in place for the next day's feast, and the old organ followed a fresh young voice that was being trained for the Easter anthem. The 5 doors of the church were standing open. On the steps of that eastern door which opened midway up the side aisle, where the morning sun had shone in upon the white faces of a hospital in wartime, in this eastern doorway sat 2 young women. "I was just thinking," one was saying to the other, "that for the first time Mistress Sydenham has forgotten to keep this day. You know that when she has forgotten everything and everybody else, she has known when Easter came, and has brought flowers to her graves." "Has she been more feeble lately, do you think?" asked the younger of the 2. "Mamma saw her the other day, and thought that she seemed more like herself, but she looked very old too. She told Mamma to bring her dolls, and she would give her some bits of silk to make them gowns. Poor Mamma! And she had just been wondering how she could manage to get us ready for summer this year. Celestine and me." And the speaker smiled wistfully. "It is a mercy that the dear old lady did forget all that happened." And the friends brushed some last bits of leaves from their skirts and rose and walked away together through the churchyard. The ancient church waited through another Easter even, with its flowers and long memory of prayer and praise. The great earthquake had touched it lightly, time had coloured it softly, and the earthly bodies of its children were gathered near its walls in peaceful sleep. From one of the high houses which stood fronting the sea with their airy balconies and colonnades, had come a small, slender figure, like some shy, dark thing of twilight out into the bright sunshine. The street was empty for the most part. Before one or two of the cheap German shops, a group of men watched the little old lady step proudly by. She was a very stately gentlewoman for one so small and thin. She was feeble too, and bending somewhat with the weight of years, but there was true elegance and dignity in the way she moved, and those who saw her, persons who shuffled when they walked and boasted loudly of the fallen pride of the South, were struck with sudden deference and admiration. Behind the lady walked a grey-headed Negro, a man who was troubled in spirit, who sometimes gained a step or two, and offered an anxious but quite unheeded remonstrance. He was a poor, tottering old fellow. He wore a threadbare evening coat that might have belonged to his late master 30 years before. The pair went slowly along the Bay Street to the end of a row of new shops, and the lady turned decidedly toward the water and approached the ferry steps. Her servitor groaned aloud, but waited in respectful helplessness. There was a group of Negro children on the steps, employed in the dangerous business of crab fishing. At the foot, in his flat-bottomed boat, sat a wondering Negro lad, who looked up in apprehension at his passengers. The lady seemed like a ghost. Old Peter, with whose scorn of modern beings and their ways he was partially familiar, old Peter was making frantic signs to him to put out from shore. But the lady's calm desire for obedience prevailed, and presently, out of the knot of idlers that gathered quickly, one, more chivalrous than the rest, helped the strange adventurers down into the boat. It was the fashion to laugh and joke in Beaufort when anything unusual was happening before the eyes of the younger part of the coloured population, but as the ferryman pushed off from shore, even the crab-fishers kept awe-struck silence, and there were speechless open mouths and much questioning of eyes that showed their whites in vain. Somehow or other, before the boat was out of hail, long before it had passed the first bank of raccoon oysters, the tide being at the ebb, it was known by 50 people that for the first time in more than 20 years, the mistress of the old Sydenham plantation on St. Helena's Island had taken it into her poor daft head to go to look after her estates, her crops, and her people. Everybody knew that her estates had been confiscated during the war, that her people owned it themselves now, in 3 and 5 and even 20-acre lots, that her crops of rice and Sea Island cotton were theirs, planted and hoed and harvested on their own account. All these years she had forgotten Sydenham and the live oak avenue and the outlook across the water to the hunting islands, where the deer ran wild. She had forgotten the war. She had forgotten her children and her husband, except that they had gone away. The graves to which she carried Easter flowers were her mother's and her father's graves, and her life was spent in a strange dream. Old Peter sat facing her in the boat. The ferryman pulled lustily at his oars, and they moved quickly along in the ebbing tide. The ferryman longed to get his freight safely across. He was in a fret of discomfort whenever he looked at the clear-cut, eager face before him in the stern. How still and straight the old mistress sat. Where was she going? He was awed by her presence and took refuge as he rowed in needless talk about the coming of the sandflies and the great drumfish to Beaufort waters. But Peter had clasped his hands together and bowed his old back as if he did not dare to look anywhere but at the bottom of the boat. Peter was still groaning softly. The old lady was looking back over the water to the row of fine houses, the once luxurious summer homes of Retts and Barnwells, of many a famous household now scattered and impoverished. The ferryman had heard of more one than bereft lady or gentleman who lived in seclusion in the old houses. He knew that Peter still served a mysterious mistress with exact devotion, while most of the elderly coloured men and women who had formed the retinues of the old families were following their own affairs, far and wide. "Oh, Lord, oh, miss, what can I go to do?" mumbled Peter, with his head in his hands. "That'll be nothing to see. Po old miss, I do know what you say. Trouble, trouble." But the mistress of Sydenham plantation had a way of speaking but seldom, and of rarely listening to what anyone was pleased to say in return. Out of the mistiness of her clouded brain, a thought had come with unwonted clearness. She must go to the island. Her husband and sons were detained at a distance. It was the time of year to look after corn and cotton. She must attend to her house and her slaves. The remembrance of that news of battle and of the 3 deaths that had left her widowed and childless had faded away in the illness it had brought. She never comprehended her loss. She was like one bewitched into indifference. She remembered something of her youth and kept a simple routine of daily life, and that was all. "I thought she done forget everything," groaned Peter again. "Oh, Lord, have mercy on all amiss." The landing place on Lady's Island was steep and sandy, and the oarsman watched Peter help the strange passenger up the ascent with a sense of blessed relief. He pushed off a little way into the stream for better self-defence. At the top of the bluff was a rough shed, built for shelter, and Peter looked about him eagerly, while his mistress stood, expectant and imperious, in the shade of a pride of India tree that grew among the live oaks and pines of a wild thicket. He was wretched with a sense of her discomfort, though she gave no sign of it. He had learned to know by instinct all that was unspoken. In the old times, she would have found 4 oarsmen waiting with a cushioned boat at the ferry. She would have found a saddle horse or a carriage ready for her on Lady's Island for the 5 miles' journey, but the carriage had not come. The poor grey-headed old man recognised her displeasure. He was her only slave left if she did but know it. "For Gord's sake, get me some kin of a cart! Ola, miss, she done wake up and mean to go out to Sydenham dis day," urged Peter. "Who dis hoss and kyart in de shed? Who make dese a track with huffs just now like they done ride by? You go get somebody for me, or she be right mad, sure." The elderly guardian of the shed, who was also of the old regime, hobbled away quickly and backed out a steer that was broken to harness, and a rickety 2-wheeled cart. Their owner had left them there for some hours, and had crossed the ferry to Beaufort. Old mistress must be obeyed, and they looked toward her beseechingly where she was waiting, deprecating her disapproval of this poor apology for a conveyance. The lady long since had ceased to concern herself with the outward shapes of things. She accepted this possibility of carrying out her plans, and they lifted her light figure to the chair in the cart's end while Peter mounted before her with all a coachman's dignity. He once had his ambitions of being her coachman, and they moved slowly away through the deep sand. "My God Almighty, look out for us now," said Peter over and over. "Ola miss, she done forget, good Lord. She done forget how de good marser up there done took from her everything. She spect now she find Sydenham all de same likes it was foe de war. She ain't know about what's been since day of de gun shoot on Port Royal and Daraway. Oh, Lord Almighty, you know how you stove her po head with dem gun shoot. Be easy to all, miss." But as Peter pleaded in the love and sorrow of his heart, the lady who sat behind him was unconscious of any cause for grief. Some sweet vagaries in her own mind were matched to the loveliness of the day. All her childhood, spent among the rustic scenes of these fertile sea islands, was yielding for her now an undefined pleasantness of association. The straight-stemmed palmettos stood out with picturesque clearness against the great level fields, with their straight furrows running out of sight. Figures of men and women followed the furrow paths slowly. Here were men and horses bending to the ploughshare, and there women and children sowed with steady hand the rich seed of their crops. There were touches of colour in the head kerchiefs. There were sounds of songs as the people worked, not gay songs of the evening, but some repeated line of a hymn to steady the patient feet and make the work go faster. The unconscious music of the blacks, who sing as the beetle drones or the cricket chirps slowly under the dry grass. It had a look of permanence, this cotton planting. It was a thing to paint, to relate itself to the permanence of art, an everlasting duty of mankind. Terrible if a thing of force and compulsion and for another's gain, but the birthright of the children of Adam, and not unrewarded nor unnatural when one drew by it one's own life from the earth. Peter glanced through the hedgerows furtively, this way and that. What would his mistress say to the cabins that were scattered all about the fields now, and that were no longer put together in the long lines of the quarters? He looked down a deserted lane, where he well remembered 50 cabins on each side of the way. It was gay there of a summer evening. The old times had not been without their pleasures, and the poor old man's heart leaped with the vague delight of his memories. He had never been on the block. He was born and bred at old Sydenham. He had been trusted in house and field. "I done like dem old times de best," ventures Peter presently to his unresponding companion. "Dere was good 'bout dem times. I say I like de old times good as any. Young folks may be a change for me." He was growing grey in the face with apprehension. He did not dare to disobey. The slow-footed beast of burden was carrying them towards Sydenham step by step, and he dreaded the moment of arrival. He was like a mesmerised creature who can only obey the force of a directing will. But under pretence of handling the steer's harness, he got stiffly to the ground to look at his mistress. He could not turn to face her as he sat in the cart. He could not drive any longer and feel her there behind him. The silence was too great. It was a relief to see her placid face and to see even a more youthful look in its worn lines. She had been a very beautiful woman in her young days, and a solemn awe fell upon Peter's tender heart, lest the veil might be lifting from her hidden past, and there, alone with him on the old plantation, she would die of grief and pain. God only knew what might happen. The old man mounted to his seat, and again they plodded on. "Peter," said the mistress. He was always frightened when she spoke. "Peter, we must hurry. I was late in starting. I have a great deal to do. Urge the horses." "Yes, miss. Yes, miss." And Peter laughed aloud nervously and brandished his sassafras switch while the steer hastened a little. They had come almost to the gates. "Who are these?" the stately wayfarer asked once, as they met some persons who gazed at them in astonishment. "I 'spect dem de good ladies from de north, what come down to show de coloured folks how to do reading," answered Peter bravely. "It do look kind of comfortable over here," he added wistfully, half to himself. He could not understand even now how oblivious she was of the great changes on St. Helena's. There were curious eyes watching from the fields, and here by the roadside an aged black woman came to her cabin door. "Lord," exclaimed Peter, "what can I do now? And old Sybil, she's done crazy too, and they'll be mischievous together." The steer could not be hurried past, and Sybil came and leaned against the wheel. "Morning, misties," said Sybil, "and yo too, Peter. How's all? Day ob judgment's comin' in morning. Some nice buttermilk. I done get rich. That's my cow." And she pointed to the field and chuckled. Peter felt as if his brain were turning. "Bless the Lord, I no more slave," said old Sybil, looking up with impudent scrutiny at her old mistress's impassive face. "You know Mars Middleton, what you buy me from? He my foster brother. We push away from same breast. He got trouble, po gentleman. He sorry to sell Sybil. He give me $silver dat day and feel bad. Neighbour Min, I say, I get good young mistis at Sydenham. I like her well, I did so. I pick my £200 all days and I ain't whipped. Too bad sold me po Mars Middleton, but he in trouble. He done come see me last planting," Sybil went on proudly. "Oh God, he grown old and poor looking. He come in just in dat do, and he say, 'Sybil, I long and long to see you, and now I see you.' And he kiss and kiss me. And there's one wide river of Jordan, and we'll soon be there black and white. I was right glad I see old Mars Middleton 'fore I die." The old creature poured forth the one story of her great joy and pride. She had told it 1,000 times. It had happened, not the last planting, but many plantings ago. It remained clear when everything else was confused. There was no knowing what she might say next. She began to take the strange steps of a slow dance, and Peter urged his steer forward, while his mistress said suddenly, "Goodbye, Sybil. I am glad you are doing so well," with a strange irrelevancy of graciousness. It was in the old days before the war that Sybil had fallen insensible one day in the cotton field. Did her mistress think that it was still that year? And Peter's mind could not puzzle out this awful day of anxiety. They turned at last into the live oak avenue. They had only another half-mile to go. And here, in the place where the lady had closest association, her memory was suddenly revived almost to clearness. She began to hurry Peter impatiently. It was a mischance that she had not been met at the ferry. She was going to see to putting the house in order, and the women were all waiting. It was autumn, and they were going to move over from Beaufort. It was spring next moment, and she had to talk with her overseers. The old imperiousness flashed out. Did not Peter know that his master was kept at the front, and the young gentlemen were with him, and their regiment was going into action? It was a blessing to come over and forget it all, but Peter must drive. They had taken no care of the avenue, how the trees were broken in the storm. The house needed. They were going to move the next day, but one and nothing was ready. A party of gentlemen were coming from Charleston in the morning. They passed the turn of the avenue. They came out to the open lawn, and the steer stopped and began to browse. Peter shook from head to foot. He climbed down by the wheel and turned his face slowly. "All amiss," he said feebly. "All amiss." She was looking off into space. The cart jerked as it moved after the feeding steer. The mistress of Sydenham Plantation had sought her home in vain. The crumbled, fallen chimneys of the house were there among the weeds, and that was all. On Christmas Day and Easter Day, many an old man and woman come into St. Helena's Church who are not seen there the rest of the year. There are not a few recluses in the parish who come to listen to their teacher and to the familiar prayers, read with touching earnestness and simplicity, as one seldom hears the prayers read anywhere. This Easter morning dawned clear and bright, as Easter morning should. The fresh-bloomed roses and lilies were put in their places. There was no touch of paid hands anywhere, and the fragrance blew softly about the church. As you sat in your pew, you could look out through the wide-open doors and see the drooping branches and the birds as they sat singing on the gravestones. The sad faces of the old people, the cheerful faces of the young, passed by up the aisle. One figure came to sit alone in one of the pews, to bend its head in prayer after the ancient habit. Peter led her as usual to the broad aisle doorway and helped her, stumbling himself up the steps, and many eyes filled with tears as his mistress went to her place. Even the tragic moment of yesterday was lost already in the acquiescence of her mind, as the calm sea shines back to the morning sun when another wreck has gone down.